Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.39, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at the comb effect inside of Bitwig Studio. So for the remainder of these videos, as we go through the comb, the ring mod, the frequency shifter, and the resonator bank, you're going to quickly realize that these four effects are quite different from the first 2, 4, 6, 7 effects that we've already covered. Now, just to kind of make it a little simpler for you, I would say that you could use these first effects on the master channel, on the mix bus. You could really use these guys in very subtle ways all over the place. Maybe the bit 8, possibly an exception there, but if you put that on really, really low settings, I'm sure people have put that on their mix bus, and I'm sure that it has been used, or something like this has been used in the mastering process, just to add some of that sound at the very bottom, right? To try to fill things up like we've talked about. These next effects we're going to look at, you really can't put on the master channel. You really can't put them on the whole mix. These aren't going to be corrective tools or really even additive tools in any way. These next tools are really creative and they're really boutiquey, because you're going to find that they'll sometimes work on certain things and at other times they're just going to have absolutely no place or no point. However, I still think it's important that you really learn these effects, understand what they're going to do, how they're going to affect your sounds. So let's jump in here and talk about the comb. Now, a lot of the effects that we talked about in the delay portion, the delay effects portion of these videos, rely on something that is referred to as comb filtering. And comb filtering is just that idea of if you have one sample and then you delay it by 1 millisecond up to approximately 50 milliseconds, our ears perceive that as one sound. And when you do that, you start to introduce these interesting sort of phase relationships with the actual signal, with the frequency spectrum, and with those harmonics. Now, the comb is a little bit different, because if we open it up here, we're going to notice that there is no setting for time. We have a frequency control and we have a feedback knob, but nothing to actually set the delay time. And whatever processing is actually going on in here, how they've coded this, I'm not 100% sure. But the reason we're talking about this in relationship to frequency as compared to delay is because we don't have that time parameter. Compare that to something like the flanger, which is really what the comb is going to end up sounding like in a lot of cases. We have time parameters here, right? We have a feedback knob, and actually the feedback negative to positive is very similar to turning on this negative button. We're going to get some new timbres, but you can equate it to that. So in certain cases, we can pull the feedback down to negative. It's going to affect the sound in one way, or we can pull it back to positive, which is going to impact the timbre of the sound in a different way. So like always, it's usually fun to try these out on our sine tones. And normally, if this was a traditional comb filtering effect, we could set the frequency around like 441, 442, and we should expect to hear something. We should expect to start to get a bit of a flanging sound. However, you're going to notice that it's not going to work quite the same way. So let's get this up and going. Play this back. Let's add a filter in here. We already know that we have a couple of those overtones that we'd like to just get out, so we can try to get this down to just a traditional sine. Okay, 4, that's fine. And now we're going to apply some of this comb filtering. All right, so that seemed to have spiked it a little bit. I'm going to take this down to 50%. And you can hear that around that 440 region, we are boosting it a little bit, but that's because this comb filter is at least picking up on the filter. However, we're not adding any harmonics. We're not adding anything at all to the frequency spectrum. And as I go around here, there are a few places where it's going to raise in volume. And again, a lot of that just has to do with the phase relationships going on. The one time that we will start to see something happen here is if we put this feedback up to 100% or down to 100%, because what we're then doing is creating a feedback loop within the comb filter. And if I just put this up to 100% and lean back, I don't have to touch anything. And over time, we will start to see some harmonics pop up, especially if we pull this across the frequency spectrum. So here we go. And now even if I turn this down, because we're at 100%, it's going to keep running back into itself, and we're going to see different harmonics rising. You can see that occurring here. So we're creating a feedback loop inside of this comb device. And so if you ever are using this in a situation like this where you boost up to 100%, sometimes it can be really interesting, but you have to make sure at certain points you pull the feedback back down. So the second I pull this down to anything, we're going to lose all of these overtones. Let's let it keep going for a little bit. I kind of always find this interesting. We're getting some new harmonics too popping up. Just like that. Now let's maybe scan around. Let's go down lower. And let's put this to negative feedback and see what we get. Negative 100%. That hit on something, didn't it? And again, over time, these are going to start to move around and start to raise. You can see it happening there. And even if I stop the clip, we're still running that feedback just to prove to you. And if we were just to let this keep going, eventually it would get really, really high and it would start to overload the system. All right, but that's not all that helpful for us. What we really are interested in is hearing how it reacts to certain sounds, how we can use this comb filter in unique and interesting ways. And the first thing I'll do is I'll play with it on the chord, and what you're going to hear is something very, very similar to what the flanger would do on the chord device. Only in this case, we're not working with a time-based effect. We can't set the time. All we can do is set the frequency and the amount of feedback. So let's just find something nice here. Turn off this filter. Hear what this sounds like with and without. All right, so that's what that negative flavor of feedback is going to sound like. Positive is going to sound a little bit more grimy, a little bit more harsh. And so this is hyping certain frequencies, but they may not necessarily be consonant or musical frequencies. It may not always sound particularly pleasing to our ears. That's why this frequency control is so important, and this is why the comb filter is a little bit different from those time-based effects that we've seen before, because instead of having to set the time to try to get it to taste, to get it right to something that sounds really nice, we can use the frequency control. So we know that our fundamental is at 440. So if I set this frequency to 880, I should expect that some of the harmonics that are going to be hyped and that we're going to hear that combing effect to are going to be maybe a little bit more consonant intervals. So I'll just command this, set it to 880. You can hear that. And then we can adjust the feedback. Really shrill, but we can check where those are peaking out at. Let's try negative. And now if I just start to move this frequency, let's take a listen. Remember in Bitwig, if you hold shift, it allows you to make micro changes. So we'll just use shift and kind of scroll around here. We can just listen to this on our other effects, or other sounds, excuse me. That sounds quite nice. That's interesting, isn't it? kick region. And we've already heard that has very little effect on the actual sine waves themselves. So mess around with that. Realize that the more harmonic content you have, the more this combing filter is going to be able to grab onto things and then either hype or reduce some of those harmonics. It's a lot of fun to mess around with, very similar to the flanger, but as you can tell, it operates and works quite differently. So thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson.